Welcome back to my channel. Before we dive in, make sure you subscribe to the channel so you never miss videos like this one. The 1800s were a century of extraordinary secrets, forgotten heroes, and unbelievable stories that history books rarely teach. Today, we are going to meet the real people behind some of the most rare and haunting photographs ever taken, images that were buried for over a century, and stories so incredible you will question everything you thought you knew about the past. Let's begin. 1. Bass Reeves, the real Lone Ranger. Get ready to have your mind completely blown. The man who inspired one of America's most beloved fictional heroes was not white, not fictional, and not a legend. He was absolutely real. Bass Reeves was born into slavery in 1838 in Crawford County, Arkansas. He escaped during the chaos of the Civil War, fleeing into Indian Territory, where he lived among the Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole nations. There, he mastered multiple Native American languages, became an expert tracker, and developed shooting skills that would become the stuff of legend. In 1875, Bass Reeves became the first black deputy U.S. Marshal west of the Mississippi River, a jaw-dropping achievement for a man who had been born in chains just decades earlier. Over the course of his career, he arrested more than 3,000 criminals, many of them the most dangerous outlaws in the American West. He was shot at countless times. His belt was shot off. His hat brim was shot through. His horse was shot from under him. And yet, Bass Reeves was never once wounded in the line of duty. Not once. He was known for his brilliant disguises, often approaching fugitives dressed as a farmer, a preacher, or a drifter. He once disguised himself as a tramp and walked 40 miles through a rainstorm to capture 2 wanted brothers who had evaded every other lawman in the territory. He captured them both before breakfast. Many historians now believe that Bass Reeves was the direct inspiration for the fictional character of the Lone Ranger, a masked lawman with a trusted companion, riding through the Wild West to bring justice. The story had been hiding in plain sight for nearly a century. Bass Reeves is remembered as one of the greatest lawmen in American history, a man whose courage, intelligence, and determination shattered the racial barriers of his era, and whose story is only now receiving the recognition it has always deserved. 2. Emperor Norton I, the self-proclaimed Emperor of the United States. History books are full of kings and queens. But only one man ever declared himself Emperor of the United States of America, and the most astonishing part is that people actually accepted it. Joshua Abraham Norton was born in England around 1818 and immigrated to San Francisco during the California Gold Rush, where he made and then spectacularly lost a massive fortune in a failed attempt to corner the rice market in 1853. The financial collapse broke his mind. He disappeared for several years. And then he came back, transformed. In 1859, Norton walked into the offices of the San Francisco Bulletin newspaper and handed the editor a handwritten proclamation declaring himself Norton I, Emperor of the United States. Remarkably, instead of laughing him out of the office, the newspaper printed it, and San Francisco played along, entirely. Norton printed his own currency. Local businesses accepted it. He issued imperial decrees ordering the construction of a bridge between San Francisco and Oakland, a bridge that was eventually built, though Norton did not live to see it. He wore a military uniform decorated with golden epaulets and a feathered hat, and was saluted by police officers on the street. He dined for free in the finest restaurants. He attended every major public event in the city as a guest of honor. When Norton died in 1880, over 30,000 people lined the streets of San Francisco to pay their respects. His funeral was funded by a group of wealthy businessmen who had never once laughed at him. Emperor Norton I is remembered as a uniquely American figure, a man who created his own reality in a city willing to dream alongside him, a symbol of eccentricity, imagination, and the strange and beautiful generosity of the human spirit. 3. Mary Anning, the fossil hunter who changed science. Imagine being the person who discovered proof that giant monsters once walked the earth, and having the entire scientific world refuse to give you credit because of your gender. Mary Anning was born in 1799 in Lyme Regis, England, a small coastal town where the cliffs along the beach were packed with ancient fossils. Her father, a carpenter and amateur fossil hunter, died when Mary was just 11 years old, leaving the family in desperate poverty. Mary took over fossil hunting as a way to earn money, crawling along dangerous, crumbling cliffs in all weather, chipping rock with a small hammer. At just 12 years old, Mary and her brother discovered the first complete ichthyosaur skeleton ever found, a massive sea creature that had lived over 200 million years ago. Scientists who had never once set foot on a beach published papers about the discovery without mentioning her name. She went on to discover the first 2 plesiosaur skeletons ever found, the first pterodactyl skeleton found outside Germany, and countless other specimens that rewrote the scientific understanding of prehistoric life. She identified coprolites, fossilized dinosaur dung, as biological material, which opened a new field of paleontological research. None of the papers published about her discoveries listed her as the author. She was never elected to the Geological Society of London, which did not admit women. She spent her entire life in poverty, selling fossils to survive, while the men who bought them from her became famous and celebrated. Mary Anning is remembered today as one of the most important scientists of the 19th century, a woman whose discoveries laid the foundation for paleontology and whose extraordinary courage in the face of poverty and prejudice changed the way humanity understood the history of life on Earth. 4. William Mumler, the man who photographed ghosts. In 1861, a Boston jewelry engraver named William Mumler accidentally made a discovery that would terrify, fascinate, and divide an entire nation. While experimenting with a camera in his studio, Mumler developed a self-portrait and found something chilling in the image, a ghostly, translucent figure standing beside him. He identified it as his deceased cousin. He showed the photograph to others. Word spread. And within months, William Mumler had become the world's first spirit photographer. People came from across the country to have their portraits taken, hoping to see the ghosts of their deceased loved ones appear beside them in the developed photograph. Mumler obliged, for a price. His studio filled with grieving mothers, widows of Civil War soldiers, and desperate fathers, all pressing his hands and weeping when they saw ghostly faces appear in the photographs beside them. His most famous client was Mary Todd Lincoln, the widow of President Abraham Lincoln, who visited Mumler's studio in disguise in 1869. The resulting photograph showed Mary Todd Lincoln seated, with the ghostly image of her late husband Abraham Lincoln standing behind her, his hands resting gently on her shoulders. The photograph became one of the most famous images of the 19th century. Mumler was eventually tried for fraud in New York City in 1869. The prosecution argued that he was a con artist exploiting the grief of bereaved families. The defense argued that no one could explain how the ghostly images appeared. He was acquitted. The court could not prove the photographs were faked. William Mumler is remembered as one of the most mysterious and controversial figures in the history of photography. Whether he was a brilliant con artist or something stranger entirely remains a question that history has never fully answered. Number 5. Joseph Merrick, the Elephant Man. Few stories from the 19th century are as heartbreaking, as brutal, and ultimately as uplifting as the story of Joseph Merrick, the man the world called the Elephant Man. Joseph Carey Merrick was born in Leicester, England in 1862, in apparently normal health. But by the time he was 5 years old, his body had begun to change in ways no doctor could explain. His skin grew thick and loose, hanging in folds from his body. His head enlarged to an enormous size. His right arm became so swollen and heavy he could barely lift it. His lips grew so large he could barely speak. For most of his childhood, his mother protected him fiercely. When she died, his father abandoned him. By his teenage years, Merrick had been admitted to a workhouse, rejected from every job he attempted, and reduced to offering himself to a showman as a circus exhibit simply to survive. He toured England and Belgium as a sideshow attraction, displayed behind a curtain that was dramatically pulled back to reveal him to gasping audiences. He was mocked, stared at, and treated as less than human by almost everyone he encountered. But in 1886, a surgeon named Frederick Treves met Merrick and changed the course of his life. Treves arranged for Merrick to live permanently at the London hospital, where he was given a private room, visitors, and for the first time in his adult life, dignity. He became friends with members of high society, was visited by the Princess of Wales, and was introduced to the theater, which he loved passionately. Merrick is believed to have had a combination of Proteus syndrome and neurofibromatosis. He died in 1890 at the age of 27. It is believed he died accidentally when the weight of his enormous head dislocated his neck while he attempted to sleep lying down, as normal people do, something he had always wished he could do. Joseph Merrick is remembered not as a freak or a curiosity, but as a man of extraordinary sensitivity, intelligence, and courage, who found humanity and beauty in a world that had shown him almost none. 6. Sarah Bartman, the Hottentot Venus. The story of Sarah Bartman is one of the most painful and important stories of the entire 19th century, a story of exploitation, racism, and a woman whose dignity was stolen from her, but whose memory has never been extinguished. Sarah Bartman was born around 1789 in what is now the Eastern Cape of South Africa, a member of the Khoikhoi people. She was orphaned as a young woman and eventually came under the control of a Dutch farmer named Peter Caesars. In 1810, Caesars and a British ship's doctor named Alexander Dunlop brought Sarah to London with the promise of a better life and good wages. Instead, Sarah Bartman was displayed in a cage in London's Piccadilly district, exhibited to paying crowds who were invited to stare at her body, specifically her large buttocks and unusual body proportions, which Europeans of the time viewed with grotesque fascination. She was made to walk back and forth like an animal, prodded with a cane, when she did not perform on command. Abolitionists brought her case to court in 1810, arguing that she was being held against her will. Sarah testified that she was participating voluntarily and receiving a share of the profits, testimony that was almost certainly given under coercion. The court allowed the exhibitions to continue. She was later taken to Paris, where she was exhibited even more aggressively, studied by scientists who produced dehumanizing papers about her body, and eventually forced into prostitution. She died in Paris in 1815 at approximately 26 years old, of a combination of pneumonia, syphilis, and alcoholism. After her death, a French scientist named Georges Cuvier dissected her body and displayed her skeleton, preserved organs, and a plaster cast of her body in the Musée de la Homme in Paris, where they remained on public display until 1974. In 2002, after a decade of negotiations, the South African government of Nelson Mandela successfully secured the return of Sarah Bartman's remains. She was buried with full honors in the land of her birth. Sarah Bartman is remembered today as a symbol of the brutal intersection of racism and exploitation in the 19th century, and as a woman whose humanity was systematically denied by the society around her, but whose story has ultimately outlasted every single person who abused her. 7. Belle Starr, the Bandit Queen. The American West produced many legends, but few were as complicated, as dangerous, or as fascinating as the woman known as the Bandit Queen of the West. Myra Maybelle Shirley, better known as Belle Starr, was born in 1848 in Carthage, Missouri. She was educated, well-read, and a skilled pianist, not the typical profile of a frontier outlaw. But the Civil War tore her family apart, and Belle was drawn into a world of outlaws that included some of the most infamous names of the era. She associated with Cole Younger and Jesse James, and married a Cherokee outlaw named Sam Starr in 1880 after the death of her previous partner. Belle Starr ran a ranch in Indian Territory that served as a safe haven for outlaws and wanted men. She rode on horseback, wearing velvet dresses and a feathered hat, with a pistol on each hip and the air of a woman who owned every room she entered. She was convicted of horse theft in 1883 and sentenced to 9 months in prison, which she served with unbroken composure. She was shot in the back in 1889, just 2 days before her 41st birthday, and died in the dirt road near her home. Her murderer was never identified with certainty, though her own son was suspected. Newspapers of the time turned her story into myth almost immediately, printing wildly exaggerated accounts of her criminal exploits that bore little resemblance to the complicated, intelligent, and defiant woman she actually was. Belle Starr is remembered as one of the most iconic figures of the American frontier, a woman who refused to be confined by the rigid boundaries of 19th century society, who lived entirely on her own terms and paid for it with her life. 8. Solomon Northup, 12 Years in Hell. Brace yourself, because this next story is one of the most extraordinary true accounts of survival and injustice in the entire history of the United States. Solomon Northup was born a free black man in Minerva, New York in 1807. He was educated, articulate, and accomplished. A skilled carpenter, farmer, and talented fiddle player who supported his wife and 3 children in relative comfort. His life was quiet, ordinary, and completely his own. Then, in 1841, Solomon was approached in Washington, D.C., by 2 men who offered him work as a musician with a traveling circus. They invited him to dinner, gave him wine, and he woke up in chains in a slave pen in the nation's capital. For 12 years, Solomon Northup was enslaved on plantations in Louisiana under the name Platt Hamilton. He was forbidden to reveal that he could read or write. He endured brutal beatings, starvation, and unimaginable daily suffering. For 12 years, he searched for any way to send word to his family in the North, but every attempt was dangerous. Revealing his true identity to the wrong person meant certain death. In 1852, Solomon finally managed to pass a letter to a white carpenter named Samuel Bass, a man from Canada who was opposed to slavery. Bass risked his own life to contact authorities in New York. In 1853, a state agent arrived on the plantation, and Solomon Northup was officially freed 12 years after he had been kidnapped. His memoir, 12 Years a Slave, published in 1853, became an immediate bestseller and an important document in the abolitionist movement. Over 30,000 copies were sold within the first 3 years. His account provided one of the most devastating first-hand testimonies of the brutality of American slavery ever recorded. Solomon Northup is remembered as a man of astonishing strength, intelligence, and perseverance. A man who maintained his identity and his spirit through 12 years of systematic dehumanization, and who, against extraordinary odds, survived to tell the truth about what he endured. 9. Calamity Jane, the woman the West could not break. When people think of the Wild West, they picture cowboys, outlaws, and gunfighters, nearly always men. But one woman shattered every single one of those assumptions with a rifle in her hand and a smile on her face. Martha Jane Canary, known to history as Calamity Jane, was born around 1852 in Princeton, Missouri. By the time she was 12 years old, both her parents were dead, and she was responsible for her 5 younger siblings. She led them west on a covered wagon, surviving a journey that killed grown men, and arrived in Montana essentially alone, essentially penniless, and entirely undaunted. Calamity Jane worked as a scout, a ox team driver, a cook, a nurse, a mail carrier, and a performer. She wore men's clothing at a time when women doing so could result in arrest. She drank in saloons with men, gambled with men, and outshot most men she ever challenged. She claimed to have served as an army scout during the Indian Wars under General Custer, a claim that historians debate but cannot definitively disprove. Her friendship with the gunfighter Wild Bill Hickok became one of the legends of the era. She nursed him until his death and requested to be buried beside him, a wish that was granted when she died in 1903. She contracted smallpox at one point while working as a scout and reportedly rode 60 miles through a raging blizzard to deliver a vital message before she allowed herself to be taken off duty. Calamity Jane is remembered as one of the most genuinely extraordinary figures of the American frontier, a woman who had every reason to collapse under the weight of hardship and instead became one of the most remarkable survivors the 19th century ever produced. 10. Annie Oakley, Little Sure Shot. She stood 5 feet tall, weighed barely 100 pounds, and could outshoot almost every man alive. At a time when women were expected to be quiet and invisible, Annie Oakley walked into the center of the arena and dazzled the entire world. Phoebe Ann Moses, known as Annie Oakley, was born in 1860 in Darke County, Ohio, in crushing poverty. Her father died when she was 6. To help feed her family, young Annie took up hunting with a rifle, selling wild game to local restaurants and hotels. By the time she was 15, she had earned enough money from hunting to pay off the entire mortgage on her family's farm. At 16, she entered a shooting competition against a professional marksman named Frank Butler. She outshot him completely. Frank Butler was so astonished and so charmed that he married her 2 years later, and they became one of the most celebrated performance partnerships in American history. Annie Oakley joined Buffalo Bill's Wild West show in 1885 and became its biggest star almost immediately. She could shoot a dime tossed in the air. She could hit the thin edge of a playing card from 90 feet away. She could shoot the flame off a candle from 50 feet. She could shoot a cigarette held in her husband's lips from over 100 feet, and Frank trusted her absolutely every single time. Sitting Bull, the great Lakota chief, met Annie Oakley and was so impressed that he informally adopted her, giving her the name Watanya Cecilia, which means Little Sure Shot. The name followed her for the rest of her life. Annie Oakley is remembered as one of the most skilled and iconic figures in the history of American entertainment, a woman who broke every rule about what women were capable of and proved it with extraordinary precision, 365 days a year. 11. Ota Benga, the man the Bronx Zoo caged. Some stories from the 19th century are so shocking, so morally catastrophic, that they are almost impossible to believe. The story of Ota Benga is one of them. Ota Benga was born around 1883 in the Congo Free State, in what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo. He was a member of the Mbuti people, known for their small stature and their extraordinary knowledge of the forest. He had a wife and children. He had a home, a community, and a life. Then the forces of Belgian colonial King Leopold II arrived. In a genocidal campaign that murdered millions of Congolese people, Ota Benga's village was destroyed and his family was massacred. He was taken captive, enslaved, and eventually purchased by an American explorer named Samuel Verner, who brought him to the United States to exhibit at the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis as a living specimen of primitive man. In 1906, the director of the Bronx Zoo in New York City arranged to display Ota Benga in the primate house alongside orangutans. A sign outside the cage listed his name, his height, his weight, and his age, exactly as if he were an animal. 40,000 people came to stare at him on a single Sunday. African-American ministers in New York protested furiously. The mayor of New York dismissed their concerns. The New York Times published an editorial defending the display on scientific grounds. Eventually, under sustained pressure, Ota Benga was released from the zoo and placed in the care of a black orphanage and then a black seminary in Lynchburg, Virginia. He learned English, began taking classes, and made friends. He seemed to be building a new life. But he never stopped grieving the family and the home he had lost. In 1916, Ota Benga built a ceremonial fire, performed rituals for his dead, and shot himself through the heart. He was approximately 32 years old. Ota Benga is remembered today as a victim of the most profound and dehumanizing racism of the 19th and early 20th centuries, and as a man whose dignity, grief, and humanity were systematically denied by a society that called itself civilized. 12. Ned Kelly, The Man in the Iron Suit. Australia in the 1870s was a land of brutal poverty, corrupt police, and desperate men. And from that landscape rose a figure so extraordinary, so strange, and so defiant that he has been argued about, celebrated, and condemned for over 140 years. Edward Ned Kelly was born in 1854 in the colony of Victoria, Australia, the son of an Irish convict father and a mother who had been transported from Ireland in chains. From his earliest years, Ned watched as police harassed and targeted his family, arresting his mother on questionable charges and brutalizing the Irish immigrant community in which he lived. In 1878, after a confrontation with police at his home, Ned Kelly and his brother Dan fled into the bush and were declared outlaws. Over the following 2 years, the Kelly gang became the most wanted criminals in Australian history, robbing banks, releasing prisoners, writing defiant letters to the government, and evading hundreds of police who pursued them across the bush. But it was their final stand at Glenrowan in 1880 that made them truly unforgettable. Ned Kelly and his gang had spent months secretly forging suits of iron armor from stolen plowshares, full suits of heavy metal plate that covered their torsos, arms, and heads, making them almost impervious to bullets. They planned to ambush a police train, derail it, and spark a full-scale uprising of the Irish poor of Victoria. The ambush failed. The battle at Glenrowan lasted through the night. The Kelly gang's armor deflected dozens of bullets, but their legs were unprotected. One by one, the gang members were shot in the legs and fell. Ned Kelly himself walked out of the burning hotel in his armor, stumbling through the early morning mist, firing his pistols with both hands, before police brought him down with multiple shots to his unprotected legs. He was hanged in Melbourne in November 1880. His last recorded words were said to be, "Such is life." Ned Kelly is remembered as the most iconic figure in Australian history, a symbol of Irish-Australian defiance, an outlaw whose homemade iron suit has become one of the most haunting images of the 19th century, and a man whose story still divides Australia between those who see a murderer and those who see a revolutionary. 13. Geronimo, the last free Apache. Few names from the 19th century carry more power, more tragedy, or more enduring respect than the name of the man who became the last symbol of Native American resistance to American expansion. Geronimo was born in 1829 in what is now New Mexico, a member of the Bedonkohe Apache Band. His birth name was Goya, meaning one who yawns. He was a skilled hunter, a devoted husband, and a father. Everything changed in 1851 when Mexican soldiers attacked his camp while the men were away trading. They massacred his mother, his wife, and his 3 young children. From that moment, Geronimo became a different kind of man entirely. Over the following decades, Geronimo became the most feared and relentless guerrilla fighter the American and Mexican armies had ever faced. He led raids across thousands of miles of desert, evading capture for decades. He was reported dead multiple times. He always reappeared. In 1886, after 38 years of resistance, Geronimo led a band of just 38 men, women, and children, 38 people against the combined armies of the United States and Mexico, totaling roughly 5,000 soldiers. The United States government sent General Nelson Miles, who offered Geronimo and his people surrender terms that promised they could eventually return to their homeland. Geronimo surrendered. It was the last formal surrender of a Native American leader in the American Indian Wars. He was never allowed to return to his homeland. He spent the rest of his life as a prisoner of war, first in Florida, then in Alabama, and finally in Oklahoma. He was displayed at the 1904 World's Fair, just like Ota Benga, sold his autograph for 25 cents to survive, and died as a prisoner in 1909, still formally classified as a prisoner of war by the United States government. Geronimo is remembered as one of the greatest military leaders in the history of the American continent, a man who fought with breathtaking skill and ferocity to protect his people, and whose final defeat was not a failure of courage, but a mathematical impossibility from the very beginning. 14. The orphan train riders, children of the rails. Between 1854 and 1929, over 200,000 children were loaded onto trains in New York City and shipped west to be distributed to farming families across the American frontier. It was one of the largest forced child migrations in human history. These children, most of them immigrants or the children of immigrants, poor, sick, orphaned, or simply abandoned by families crushed by poverty, were gathered from the streets of New York by a charitable organization called the Children's Aid Society, founded by Charles Loring Brace. Brace believed that removing children from the corruption and poverty of New York's slums and placing them with wholesome farm families was the most humane solution to child poverty. The children were bathed, given clean clothes, and loaded onto trains headed west. At each stop, they were lined up on station platforms or in town halls, while local families walked by and chose the children they wanted, much as one might select an animal at a market. Children who were not chosen were loaded back onto the train and taken to the next town. Some children found loving homes and lived happy lives. Others were taken for their labor, treated as servants or farmhands, separated from their siblings forever, and given new names that erased their identities. Brothers and sisters were routinely split between different families and never saw each other again. Among the orphan train riders were several individuals who went on to remarkable lives, including 2 future governors of American states and multiple prominent politicians and businessmen. Most, however, disappeared into history, their original names forgotten, their true origins unknown even to their own children and grandchildren. The orphan train riders are remembered today as a reminder of a time when poverty was solved not with compassion, but with displacement, and as a generation of children who were asked to pay an extraordinary price for the failures of the society into which they were born. 15. The last photograph of Abraham Lincoln, captured hours before his death. On the morning of April 14, 1865, President Abraham Lincoln sat for his last known photograph. It was taken in Washington, D.C., by photographer Henry Warren. Lincoln looks tired beyond description, aged far beyond his 56 years by 4 years of the bloodiest war in American history. His eyes are deep-set and shadowed. His face carries a weight that feels almost visible. That same evening, Abraham Lincoln attended a performance of Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. At approximately 10:15 in the evening, John Wilkes Booth entered the presidential box and fired a single shot into the back of Lincoln's head. Lincoln was carried across the street to a boarding house called the Peterson House, where he died the following morning at 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865. He never regained consciousness. What makes the last photograph so unbearably powerful is the knowledge of what the man in the image could not know, that within hours the war he had fought so desperately to end would be won, and he would not live to see the peace. That the nation he had held together with his extraordinary will and political genius was about to be freed from its greatest internal wound, and he would not be there to guide it through what came next. The photograph sat largely unrecognized for decades until it was identified by a Lincoln scholar in the early 20th century. Today it is considered one of the most historically significant photographs ever taken. Abraham Lincoln is remembered as arguably the greatest president in American history, a man who rose from absolute poverty in a log cabin to the highest office in the nation, who held the Union together through 4 years of catastrophic war, and whose assassination at the moment of victory created a wound in American history that can still be felt today. 16. John Pemberton, the man who accidentally invented Coca-Cola. The final story in today's collection is the story of a discovery so unexpected, so accidental, and so world-altering that it reads more like fiction than history. John Stith Pemberton was born in 1831 in Knoxville, Georgia. He trained as a pharmacist, fought as a Confederate officer in the Civil War, and at the Battle of Columbus in April 1865 received a severe saber wound to the chest. The wound left him in chronic pain. Like many Civil War veterans, he was prescribed morphine to manage it. Like many Civil War veterans, he became addicted. Determined to find a cure for his addiction that would not require another drug, Pemberton began experimenting in his pharmacy laboratory in Atlanta with various plant extracts and chemicals. In 1885, he created a drink he called Pemberton's French wine coca, a mixture of coca leaf extract, cola nut, and wine that he sold as a medicine to cure morphine addiction, headaches, and exhaustion. When Atlanta enacted Prohibition in 1886, Pemberton removed the alcohol and replaced it with carbonated water. He mixed the new syrup with the water and tasted it. He found it surprisingly delicious. His bookkeeper, Frank Robinson, suggested a name for the two main ingredients, coca leaves and cola nuts, and wrote it in the elegant script that still exists today. He called it Coca-Cola. Pemberton sold the recipe for just $750 in 1888 before he died. He never knew what he had created. He never saw a single glass of Coca-Cola sold in a country other than the United States. He never saw the red and white logo become one of the most recognized symbols on the planet. John Pemberton is remembered as one of history's great ironies, a man who set out to cure his own pain, failed, and accidentally created the most successful commercial beverage in human history while dying broke and forgotten. And that is the incredible truth hiding inside these rare photographs from the 1800s. Every single one of these images captures not just a face, but an entire world of courage, tragedy, genius, and survival that most of us were never taught in school. History is not a collection of dates and battles. It is the story of real people living extraordinary lives under extraordinary pressure in an extraordinary time. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you. It means you are someone who genuinely loves discovering the truth about the past. Make sure you hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss a video like this one. Drop a comment below and tell me, which story shocked you the most? Which person from this video do you think deserves their own full documentary? We read every single comment, and your answer might inspire our next video. Like this video if it changed the way you see the 1800s, and share it with one person you know who loves history, because they deserve to know these stories too. We will see you in the next one.